Welcome to Lexington Public Library's Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast, where we explore Lexington's history and people. I'm your host, David Bryant, and in each episode, we will feature a guest who will share a piece of local history. Thank you for listening, and I hope you enjoy. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to the Tales from the Kentucky Room podcast. Today, I'm really excited to be speaking with Dr. Elizabeth DeWolfe. She is the author of Alias Agnes, the Notorious Tale of a Gilded Age Spy. Dr. DeWolfe joins us from Southern Maine, where she is a professor at the University of New England. She's the author of numerous books and journal articles, and so we're really excited to talk to her today. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here and to share some of the research that I did in Kentucky.
Yes, and I hope you're having pleasant weather in Maine today, like we are in Kentucky. There's probably no guarantee of that.
Well, it's actually quite a nice day today, but we will not have nice weather tomorrow.
Okay, so enjoy it while you can.
Exactly.
Yeah. So, looking at your website, I saw a really interesting quote where you said that your passion is to write the stories of ordinary women's extraordinary lives. So I thought a great way to start the interview would just tell us what this book, Alias Agnes, is about, please.
Sure. So Alias Agnes is about two women who were chasing their dreams. One was Madeleine Pollard, and she became the most infamous woman of 1894. The other was Jane Tucker, and she was a stenographer turned undercover detective. And Madeleine and Jane's lives intersected in Washington, D.C., when Madeleine sued her former lover, Congressman William Breckinridge of Kentucky, and she sued him for breach of promise for failing to marry her. Now, Breckinridge was seeking an edge in this nationally watched trial, so he secretly hired Jane Tucker to locate and befriend Madeleine Pollard, and in their heart-to-heart talks, steal her secrets. So Alias Agnes is the story of Madeleine Pollard and Jane Tucker's 10-week fraught friendship, all behind the scenes of this nationally watched trial.
Okay. Can you tell us a little bit more about who Madeleine Pollard was and her Kentucky roots?
Sure. Madeleine was born in Crab Orchard, Kentucky, or lived there as a young girl. She was an early reader. She was a precocious learner. She dreamed of an education and a literary, cultured life. But sadly, her father died suddenly in 1876, and this shattered the Pollard family. Madeleine's mother was forced to split up the children. Some went to a Masonic orphanage, some remained with her, and Madeleine was sent to live with an aunt in Pittsburgh. She comes back to Kentucky when she is around 17, 18 years old. Again, still dreaming of a higher education. She wants to go to college, but there's no possible way for her to do that until she meets a bachelor farmer, an old family friend of sorts, a man named James Rhodes, and he offers a deal. He will pay her tuition if, when Madeleine completes her education, she will marry him. Or, Madeleine throws in, I'll pay you back. And so off Madeleine goes to Cincinnati Wesleyan Female College, a very good college for young ladies. And she loves it. But she realizes that the education that she hoped would free her from a rural domestic life because of her deal was just pulling her right back in. And then James Rhodes ran out of money. It was time to marry.
Mhm.
And Madeleine had no one else to turn to, so she sought help from an up-and-coming politician and Lexington lawyer, William C. Breckinridge. He visits the college, there's a carriage ride, a stolen kiss, and 3 days later, they are lovers. A decade and 3 pregnancies later, Pollard and Breckinridge are at the center of this nationally watched breach of promise trial.
Yeah, and it was a trial that captivated the nation, apparently. On the other side, with Jane Tucker, she basically had kind of an opposite life growing up to Madeleine Pollard, correct?
She really did. Where Madeline in Crab Orchard was brought up in the shadow of healthful spas and freshwater springs that people from the Kentucky cities would come to Crab Orchard in the summers and enjoy culture and music and literature. So Madeline grows up in that sort of milieu. Jane Tucker was a tomboy from Maine. She rode horses, she built fires on the beach, she could fire a gun, and she bragged that she could climb a tree higher than her boyfriends to the amazement and worry of her girlfriends. And so Jane dreams of an independent life. She wants to provide for herself and not be tied to father or husband. So, looking into the future, Jane realized that what she needed to learn was typing and stenography, new skills for new opportunities for women. And so she learns these skills and she works in Boston and New York in really what we would call a secretarial fashion. But in 1893, the economy was absolutely awful. It rivaled the Great Depression. And in quick succession, she lost 2 jobs. So by the early winter of 1894, she is back in Maine at the family home, and she really felt like a failure. She wanted to be independent, but here she is back in the domestic sphere. But then letters and telegrams arrive from a former employer begging her to take a secret job. They meet in Boston where he shares all the details. It turns out her former boss is Lexington businessman and attorney Charles Stoll, who in 1894 is an attorney working for Congressman Breckinridge. Jane accepts the job, and when she arrives in Washington, D.C., she is now Agnes Parker.
Mhm. And hence how we see the two lives intersect, and hence your book. So how did you get interested in this topic, and how were you able to make the connection between the two women?
Like many of my projects, I say I don't find them, they find me. So in this case, I was actually at a rare book and antique show in New Hampshire with my husband, who's a rare book dealer. And I'd gone with him just to help out. But the show was coming to an end. We still had a couple hours to go, and the crowd was thin, and I was getting a little bored. So I looked at another dealer's stock, and there I found what's called a salesman's sample. It's a mock up of a book that publishers would produce to see how many they might be able to sell if they go ahead and publish it. And this is kind of like Amazon preview Gilded Age style.
Mhm.
And I read this salesman sample, which has a few scattering of pages and some illustrations about the trial. And I had never heard of this event, and it really stuck in my head. So when I came home that evening, I did a little quick Google research and I found out that this salesman sample was indeed turned into a book in 1894. And it was a compilation of newspaper articles written about the trial. So when I read it, I was amazed by Madeleine's bravery to sue a sitting congressman. But I also wondered about her life before and after this trial, because no one then, or really in recent years, had asked those questions. The assumption seemed to be that once a mistress, always a mistress. So I wanted to find out Madeleine's full story. So this project started as what I imagined was going to be a biography of Madeleine Pollard. But in the course of my research on Madeleine at the Library of Congress, I was reading Breckinridge's papers. Breckinridge family papers are held at the Library of Congress. And as I was reading his correspondence between Breckinridge and his attorneys and constituents, I picked up hints of some sort of a scheme. Attorney Charles Stoll saying, I've spoken to the young woman, but I dare not put details in writing. We'll tell you more this evening. And comments like that. Then I started to see references in his letters to Miss P or Miss Parker. And I remembered that a book had been published, The Real Madeleine Pollard by Agnes Parker. Reading that book told me that it was possible that Breckinridge had hired a woman to be an undercover detective. I couldn't believe that would be true, but what if it was? And so several weeks of very difficult research with lots of dead ends finally revealed that Miss Parker was very real indeed. This did really happen. And that Miss Parker was a young woman named Jane Armstrong Tucker. And the big surprise for me was that Jane is from Maine, where I live. So at that point, I knew I was writing a very different book than the one I had first planned.
Indeed. And it sounds like the pieces just kind of came together, but it sounds like there's really some really advanced sleuthing skills on your part to piece all this information together.
Yeah, and for every, fabulous discovery or piece of the puzzle that falls into place, there's 100 pieces that don't fit.
Mhm. Yeah. As we said earlier, the trial was a story that captivated the nation at the time. And to set the scene, what else was going on at the US in the US at that time?
Well, it's the Gilded Age and Progressive Era. So you have incredible socioeconomic diversity and disparity from the Astors and the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and members of the elite 400 to dirt poor immigrants and homeless children running amok in the streets. The economy in 1893 and through much of the 1890s is in absolute shambles with lots of economic uncertainty. So, working class men and women like Jane Tucker can lose their jobs overnight. But the richest of the rich could likewise go from riches to rags with a bad investment. The US is on the cusp of a new and modern era with the approach of the new century. So, for as much as was challenging, there was also a sense of optimism. It's the immigrant dream of gold in the streets, or it's the working class young man starting out as a clerk and dreaming that he will end up owning his own shop. Did it happen a lot? Probably not. But what's important is it's this pervasive belief that it could happen that guides the US toward the next century. So it's a fascinating time. It's a
Mhm.
fascinating time.
Yeah, absolutely fascinating.
Mm.
How unusual was Madeline Pollard's lawsuit at that time?
Yeah, it was quite gutsy for her to use breach of promise, as her kind of, legal complaint against Breckinridge, because breach of promise was used primarily by the daughters of the leisured classes, and it was a way for them and their families to regain or assert respectability. That was the important virtue for young women, respectability. So breach of promise was the way for them to regain respectability in the wake of being jilted or left at the altar. It's a way for those daughters to say, it's him, not me.
Mm-hmm.
So for Madeleine to use this, she is implicitly claiming that she is a respectable woman and that Breckinridge is at fault here. Now, if she had been a domestic servant and became his mistress, breach of promise law wouldn't be possible because, with a rather, racist and classist stereotype of the day, the belief was, well, domestic servants don't have any respectability to lose, so you can't regain what you never had in the first place. So the trial is about if and what Breckinridge promised to Pollard. But really, it's about her legitimacy in her social circles. Was she trying to hop above her place, or did she truly belong there? And so much of the trial hinges on parsing out Madeleine's claims for a literary life. Was that just an affectation, or was that really her ambition? So it's a fascinating and clever and gutsy move.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. William C.P. Breckinridge, what can you say about him? Like, what were his politics like at the time?
Yeah. He was a resident of Lexington, as I'm sure many of your listeners
Mm-hmm.
know, an attorney. And from 1884 to 94, he was in the House of Representatives, representing Kentucky. He was a Democrat. He is not really remembered for any particular landmark legislation, but he did have quite the reputation as a gifted orator. And he gave speeches all over the country, and he was quite popular. And so he could be a spokesman for his vision of a new South. On the one hand, he argued that he supported women's movements into new areas, such as college, such as the law, as his own daughter, Sophonisba, both went to college in Massachusetts. She went to Wellesley, and she became the first woman who passed the Kentucky bar. But at the same time, and in his very private life, he had more traditional views of womanhood. So he was popular. He sat on powerful committees like the House Appropriations Committee. He had political power and influence. In the early 1890s, before the scandal broke, there were rumors that he would be nominated for an even higher office, but that didn't come to pass.
Mm-hmm. In the author's note, you mention the sources you used to construct the story, and you talked about this briefly beforehand, finding the salesman sample. After you found the letters, the correspondences, how do you piece that together to turn it into a story like you so masterfully did in the book?
Thank you. Yeah, that's the trick, right?
Mhm.
You have all these factoids, and one of the downsides or one of the challenges in writing history is the impetus to write this happened, then that happened, then this happened, and then on
Mhm.
Tuesday. And I would say that I wanted to write this book as a narrative that unfolds, which really kind of mirrored how I came to the story in the first place. History is a story with highs and lows and characters and denouements. And so the way to do this, the way I do this is kind of twofold. First is the research. This has to be deeply researched. If I said it was snowing on a day, it was snowing because I read it in the paper. Everything in that book has a source, either a historical source like a letter or diary, or a source from the period. And so, one thing that I had to do was I had to triangulate my sources because we can't believe everything we read. Newspapers get it wrong or they're biased right from the start. The real Madeleine Pollard, there are scenes in there that Jane has either confused or invented. So, what you need to do is take information from multiple sources, and that helps you develop the authenticity. I also, in my research, I read the books my subjects read, I eat the food they ate. As much as possible, I go to where they went to school, where they lived, where they worked, where they walked to try to get that sense. So, research first. Then, when I write, I see the scene in front of me. That's what I try to do is build that cultural map in my head. So I am walking down Huntington Avenue in Boston when Jane Tucker is headed to her typing school. Or, for example, I had the very good fortune to be in the courtroom where this was tried. And I sat in that room for the morning session of court. And what I picked up was, what are the views out the window? What did it sound like as women walked up to the front of the courtroom? And I could hear their high heels on the marble floor. What about the echo out in the lobby where Madeleine's attorneys and the Breckinridge team actually had a fist fight after one day in court? So you get those sensory details, and that's how I write. I try to describe what I'm seeing, hearing, feeling, even smelling,
Wow.
and that's how I did it. I will also say, I am a senior faculty member, 30 years at my university. So my writing style has changed over time from, the first book you write after your dissertation is very academic. You're showing your chops. I wanted to write a book that would be read and readable and enjoyed by non-academics, a broader audience. And so one thing that I did, in addition to all the deep research, was I read extensively narrative nonfiction to really get that sense of turning a historical but factual story into a narrative.
Wow, that's truly fascinating. And dare I ask what kind of foods you did eat? If you did you find that from letters, like correspondences from the time, or how did you do that?
A lit Yeah, a little of both. Some of it, appears in letters, but the key scenes appear in the real Madeleine Pollard because one of the skills that Jane brought to her spying was culinary, and Jane and Madeleine were using really a culinary code. So Madeleine would throw out little gems like she knew how to make a brand new dish that had gone from a food for the poor, really, to a food for the wealthy. Madeleine bragged that she knew how to make lobster a la Newburgh. Uh, she also, and that is to show that she's familiar with the food of the elite. And she also talked about how she could make Welsh rarebit. That's the number one snack of college girls in that period of time. So she's saying, "Yes, I went to college. I know how to make the Welsh rarebit," which is basically melted cheese on bread. Who wouldn't like that? Jane picks up on this right away. And so when Jane, who Madeline knows as Agnes, visits her each evening after court to try to pry information out of Madeline, she always brings a snack. And one of her most successful snacks was tomato salad with French dressing. Tomatoes and fresh vegetable salads in the 1890s were a food of the elite. And so she is saying to Madeline, "I see you. You're legit. and French dressing, which is not the orange stuff, but rather vinaigrette. Anything French, as anyone who watches HBO's Gilded Age knows, anything French is valued by the elite. So when Jane makes this tomato salad with a vinaigrette, Madeleine feels seen. And as Jane recorded, Jane wrote, "As she ate my salad, she opened her heart to me." So this is his culinary code. So yes, I've eaten Welsh rarebit,
Mhm.
and I'm quite fond of tomato salad. I'm afraid I had to pass on the lobster Newburg. I am somewhat of a bad Mainer and cannot eat shellfish. Had to pass on the Newburg.
And that's understandable. Okay, and so you mentioned the book The Real Madeleine Pollard, and it turns out that Lexington Public Library had the only copy of that book, if I'm not
Yes.
mistaken. So, did you make a trip to Lexington to use the source?
Absolutely, absolutely. So my first encounter with the real Madeleine Pollard was a microfilm version at the Library of Congress. So they had the microfilm, but they no longer had an original copy. That book was key. The real Madeleine Pollard is, Jane writes it after the conclusion of the trial, and it reveals in a series of letters to the attorneys her day by day undercover detective work with Madeleine Pollard. So I looked for an actual copy, and that's when I learned that the Lexington Public Library has the only extant copy. And when you see it, you realize how fragile it is. It was not published as great literature. It was a piece the publisher was printing. It was designed to make some quick money off a hot scandal. So it was cheaply made, it was cheaply bound, and no doubt many copies fell apart over time. Also, while there's some very engaging scenes in there, the book kind of peters out 2/3 of the way through. It's not a very good read for the long term. So we're quite fortunate that, when I was using the book in the library and discussing with the library staff the significance of the real Madeleine Pollard, that led to a grant to preserve and digitize it. So now it is available as an ebook from the library.
Yes. Yes, we're very happy about that.
Yeah.
So, is the style of the book, is it hot, gossipy? Is it that kind of style?
Yeah, it can be quite snarky,
Okay.
which is Jane Tucker. She is snarky, she is judgy,
Mhm.
she has little time for fools. She will call out people and in her diaries from her youth and, young womanhood, at one point, she recorded all the Christmas gifts she got, which ones she was gonna return, and which ones were made of poor stuff. So, the real Madeleine Pollard was written for a very specific agenda. It was the idea of Jane and Charles Stoll to write this book, to try to paint Madeleine in a negative light in case of an appeal of the verdict of the trial. So it has a very specific agenda. However, Jane takes on this project and puts her own twist on it, including comments about the Breckinridge's legal team not listening to her advice. And that was very much to their detriment. So she gets her shots in. And she does judge Madeline repeatedly throughout the book. For example, in one particular day in the trial, Madeline breaks down in tears talking about, an infant, her infant, who died. shortly after birth, and she breaks down. But that night, back at the House of Mercy where Madeleine was staying, Jane notes that Madeleine had quite a large appetite and opines that a woman who really was sad about the death of an infant wouldn't eat.
Mm.
So we see some of her judgment in
Mhm.
there, but behind the judgment is also, I think, Jane trying to work it out. Is she legit? Is she really mourning? Is she not? What can I use as evidence? So it's a really fascinating read, but some parts of it are quite judgy and snarky and pretty funny too.
Yeah. So that might be a good transition back to talk about the outcome of the case, what ended up happening.
Well, if anyone does not want to know, put your hands over your
Oh,
ears right now.
spoiler alert, yes.
Spoiler alert. Well, Pollard wins.
Mhm.
Pollard wins, and so we learn that words matter. The judge, in particular, in his charge to the jury, and several times throughout the trial, makes the point that what Madeline did or did not do with men prior to meeting Breckinridge had no impact in this case. This case was about, did Breckinridge promise? Yes or no? So this case brings to focus the sexual double standard. And as a result, a group of progressive reformers, women in Washington, bring to Congress a request for a morality clause that would punish congressmen who behave badly. Interestingly, those women also send flowers the day the verdict is announced to Pollard's attorney for winning this fight on behalf of women. And they send flowers to the elite women who, in their words, bravely testified, such as Mary DeShay, Breckinridge's sister in law, and Julia Churchill Blackburn, who was the society leader of the Southern contingent in Washington. But they did not send flowers to Pollard. So, in the long view, the case itself had no real impact legally.
Okay.
By by the 1920s, breach of promise is rarely used. It's mostly because by then it's less tragic for women to be jilted because they have plenty of other options for making their way in the world, and they're in a world that's a bit more sexually permissive. But one thing that does happen is the case becomes kind of a popular culture touchstone. So whenever a well-known man was caught in a similar situation, Madeleine Pollard's name was invoked, right? So and so has found his Madeleine Pollard. And Pollard remains a punchline or a stereotyped character of love crazed women or a woman scorned up until the 1940s, although both of those images are false in Madeleine's case.
Okay. So what happens to Pollard and Agnes later in life? Where do they go from there after the case?
Well, Madeline, interestingly, turns down every offer that was made to her. So as the trial is wrapping up, publishers, the managers of opera houses and Broadway theaters, and all sorts of people want to pay Madeline to tell her story, sing a song, be in a play, write a book. She turns them all down. She refuses to profit, as she says, off of her shame. So Madeline leaves the country. Now, she's not running away and she's not hiding, but rather she's finally living her long held dream. She becomes an American expat. And from 1897 on, she spends the rest of her life in England. She travels the continent. And even when she's in her 60s, she comes back to New York City and studies literature at Columbia University. So she remains in England, in the UK, and she dies in 1945. So here is a woman who was born during the Civil War and died at the tail end of World War II. And, when she traveled back to the US on one occasion, she traveled first class.
Mhm.
So Madeline got her dream. She didn't change her name. She didn't, hide. She just lived her life. After the trial, Jane writes the real Madeleine Pollard, and Charles Stoll tells her, "We're going to make big money on this. $1,000." Jane thinks, "Wow, this is great. I'm finally going to get out of the financial hole." But the book bombs. It is crucified by reviewers, mostly because in the book, Jane appears unwomanly. She talks about her facility at creating lies and how she grows to like it. So Jane returns home to Maine, and her family, who did not know what she was doing, they assumed she was just a stenographer in Washington. She tells them of her adventures, and they are not amused. And it is telling that there's no copy of the real Madeleine Pollard in her historic home or archive. So Jane continues her working life as a single urban woman. She worked in Boston and New York again. For a while, she was a salesperson for Butterick, and she was a traveling salesperson, went out west as far as Montana. After her mother died in the early 1920s, and Jane returns to Maine and the family home, runs a number of home businesses. She never marries, and she dies in 1964 and is buried in Maine. And her family home became a historic house museum in Wiscasset, Maine, right on the coast. And today it is a property of the Preservation and Architectural Society, Historic New England, and it is well worth visiting.
Yeah, it sounds like it. This is a truly fascinating story. I'm wondering if it could be a spin-off series from The Gilded Age on HBO. So,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
so if there's any producers listening, Dr. DeWolfe is probably open. So,
Oh, yeah. Absolutely.
so are there any other points you'd like to make about the book that we didn't cover?
I think that a couple of them. I think that what the story tells us is that there's a lot more to women's history than we think.
Hmm.
N Oftentimes, we're bounded by conventional wisdom or a broad stereotype, right? The idea that once a mistress, always a mistress. And because of that, no one bothers to ask the question. What was her life before? What led her to make these choices? What happens afterwards? Was the Breckinridge Pollard trial the apex of her life? And my answer would be no. It was one scene in a long, long life. So I think we need to question our assumptions when we look at the past lives of women and dig deeper. The other point I would make, and this really surprised me in my research, was how many women tell their tales in the courtroom in the Pollard Breckinridge trial. So the fascinating thing is that when a woman would get on the stand, the lawyers tried to figure out their social positioning. It's a way of trying to determine whether these women will lie. And so Julia Churchill Blackburn gets on the stand, and she's the widow of the former governor of Kentucky. And the lawyer says something, like, "You are the widow of the governor, are you not?" She just says, "You know I am." She takes no grunt from these lawyers. You do not mess with Julia Churchill Blackburn. And so you get that with every woman who gets on the stand, down to or including formerly enslaved African American woman named Sarah Gist. And Sarah Gist gets up on the stand, and now she is in a courtroom entirely of white men. And the lawyers make her relate her whole history, starting with enslavement up until her interaction with Pollard at Breckinridge. So in those moments, we get stories of formerly enslaved women, a socialite, working class women. And what we learn is that all of these women are just trying to get their little slice of the American dream, and they are working despite and around the challenges that patriarchy, racial hierarchy, social mores place in front of them. To me, it is absolutely fascinating.
Yeah, absolutely.
This
I
was a
agree. Yeah,
yeah, yeah, this was a trial of women. Yeah.
absolutely. It's been really a pleasure talking to you today and hearing about your book and your research. Do you have any future projects you're working on that you'd like to talk about?
Well, I can tell you that in 81 days, I will be retiring,
Okay.
not that I'm counting,
Mhm.
and I've got a long list of potential
Okay.
projects. I will just say this, that I've been doing some preliminary research. It's too early to discuss, so I'll just say petty crime, Gilded Age, Chicago.
Oh, okay.
Stay tuned.
Well, we look forward to hearing more about that. And Dr. DeWolfe, it's been wonderful speaking to you today. Thank you so much.
Thank you. It was my pleasure to research this book at the library in Lexington. Thank you for all your wonderful assistance, and thank you for your interest in Alias Agnes.
Thank you. Thanks for listening to Tales from the Kentucky Room, a podcast brought to you by the Central Library's Kentucky Room staff at the Lexington Public Library. If you enjoyed listening, please take a minute to subscribe, rate, and review the podcast on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you get your podcast. And please remember to recommend the podcast to friends. If you have any questions about local history or genealogy research, you can visit us in the Kentucky Room to use our collection and newspaper microfilm. Or you can email us at elibrarian@lexpublib.org. That's elibrarian@lexpublib.org. I'm David Bryant, and we'll be back with another episode next month.